ask you, please, eyes down and looking, turn to the item 23, which is the finalisation of the draft proposal to amend the district plan in relation to the residential unit overlay using section 71 of the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Act 2016. And we've got the team coming to the end of the table. Now we're doing this so that we can address this before the while the community board members are still here. So thanks very much for that. And just before we get underway, can I just say thank you to staff on behalf of the councillors for really putting in the hard yards on this one. I think the preliminary work by going out to the strategic partners and advising them that this was coming, and then asking them to meet the 7-day turnaround again, even though we were early getting it to them. Everyone stepped up, so you know, please pass on our thanks to the strategic partners as well, but you've really done a great job to bring it back. I've only got one question, which I've kind of previously notified, and that's in relation to the feedback from ECAN. And I do understand the need to address what would be otherwise an inconsistency based on when the house was demolished as to whether existing use rights would apply. But both ECAN and actually the South Brighton Residents Association have raised a concern about existing use rights. And so the question is should the, I mean, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the P2 proposal be turned into a resource consent application or a restricted discretionary activity or anything like that. I'm suggesting that it remain a permitted activity. The question that ECAN raises, and I guess by implication the South Brighton Residents Association one does, is whether there ought to be conditions that apply in relation to the need to mitigate. So.
Sure. So we'll come to the answer to that question, Leanne, very shortly, and both Mike and I will do our very best to answer that. But just for all councillors' benefit, just to remind you, this is the third and final report to council on this matter that's occurred over the last 2 months or so. And this report back follows your 15th of October decision to, as Leanne described, seek the input of strategic partners. That has occurred, and as Leanne says, we are grateful to strategic partners for both their constructive comments, but also the timeliness of those comments as well. That was fantastic. The strategic partners have provided both feedback and also some other areas that they've flagged that we should look at, including areas such as practice notes. So for those latter ones, we'll absolutely take those on board, and staff are already working to give effect to those ones. The proposal as proposed in the draft is unchanged as we bring it back to you today, but we note that your question, and I'll come to that. So some of the suggestions were out of scope and we couldn't do. Some of them we can pick up in other mechanisms, and some of them, including the P2 condition suggestion, we don't think are appropriate. On the P2 rule, which is P stands for permitted activity, which is an important distinction between restricted discretionary activity under a resource consent. So a permitted activity, it's permitted. As we've talked about before, the basis for this is to address a fairness issue that by arbitrary nature of the timing of when a dwelling demolition occurred, some people were unfairly treated compared to others. So the purpose of that rule, as we've proposed, is to provide a greater level of fairness. If conditions were added to that rule, such as those same conditions that are considered under the restricted discretionary activity status, then in effect it would make that a resource consent application, and it would mean that the hurdle for a permitted activity reverts back to being a restricted discretionary activity resource consent hurdle, which is a far greater hurdle. There's also some good planning reasons why that Mikey will touch on, but we have explained this in paragraph 5.12 of the paper to some extent as well. And just before I finish, just to talk about the next steps. If the proposal is approved by council, then that will turn into the final proposal, and that will be provided to the Minister for Greater Christchurch Regeneration, and then she will make a decision to seek public input, and following this, assuming she makes the decision to seek public input, following that, then she'll need to make a final decision on approving or not approving the proposal as we submit it. So just to reiterate, she can't change the proposal, so we are keen that we make sure that we get it right. In terms of the timeframes for that, some weeks ago I was less confident, but I am now confident that that will be able to be completed before Christmas. So we're ready to go, and it will go out immediately to the Minister. The draft notices are all ready to go. Mike in particular has been working very closely with both Regen and Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, so they're all lined up, ready to go, and I'm confident that the Minister will give particular regard to the timeframes for this as well. And just to also re-emphasise the same point, Leanne, that you made, particular thanks to Mikey and David on my left and right, but also Linda, who is here as well and often doesn't get thanked for these things, but she's been exemplary in the communication with residents, as has Katie. Brent from the legal team, and Nathan and John from the resource consents team as well, and also the community board members and the community groups that have been constructive in this as well, that actually we've all got on the same page on this, and it's been a good piece of work to work on over the last 2 months. So,
yeah, I think the updates have been really helpful, and it's been really good to see the community pick them up and throw them on their Facebook pages and other forms of social media, so it's really, really good.
So, Micah, did you want to add to the answer to Leanne's question about the P2?
Yeah, and probably just clarify as well. So, if you put the types of conditions that would be necessary on a permitted activity rule to essentially make sure that appropriate mitigation was occurring, that they really require quite detailed assessment to ensure that they are appropriate, and that's why it's inappropriate for a permitted activity rule. You'd be having the type of assessment that you would normally have in a resource consent process, and that's inconsistent with planning practice for permitted activities, and that's why we've essentially said it's not appropriate in this instance. There's also the fact that the original permitted activity rule that we're trying to sort of just extend for those other sites that had a house on prior to the earthquakes, they don't have those types of assessment matters, and so we'd essentially be creating a new type of rule that we haven't had the time to assess the effect of it, whereas the way that we're doing it, we're just using that same rule back to that date. So
yeah, I think the reason that I'm asking the question was, and thank you for that, it's a good summary of the situation, because the only reason I'm asking it is because it wasn't contemplated by the independent hearings panel, and this process was designed to focus on the independent hearings panel intention in terms of creating a residential unit overlay. So if we hadn't proposed the new P2, then it would have been picked up in the residential unit overlay and would have been a restricted discretionary activity. Is that right?
yes.
Yeah. So that's the reason I'm asking the question, because what we're offering up as part of this process is it actually goes beyond what the independent hearings panel proposed.
It does in terms of their discussion and assessment and the decision, but they did have P1 in there, which the intent of P1 was to allow earthquake damaged properties to rebuild without the need for a resource consent, and there was a technicality associated with it that we have adapted to. So in terms of their reasons for granting P1, they still stand in terms of P2 as well. So while not explicitly addressed, it's not inconsistent.
That's what I've been encouraging you to say, because it's not written. It's not written in the report. But I think when we do our next update and when we provide advice, because we're going to have to provide advice to support this to the Crown, aren't we? So I think it would be really important to highlight the fact that this addresses something that may have been unstated explicitly by the independent hearings panel, just simply by the timing of when the house was demolished. So I think it's really important to be crystal clear, because the last thing I want is for something that wasn't explicitly referenced in the IHP decision to end up being the stumbling block, as it were. Yep. So thank you very much. That was a very clear explanation as to why. Thank you. Right, Sarah and Phil.
Thank you. Just two quick questions. Houses that are currently existing in the residential unit overlay, so currently where people are living and it's all fine, earthquake repairs are done and stuff, if those people wanted to demolish and rebuild their houses currently and maybe make it two-storey, increase the overall floor area but not the ground footprint, do they need a resource consent to do that?
They would fall under the P1 or P2 rule as it stands.
If the ground floor area
without
is the
P2,
same
no, without
or similar.
P2, without P2, but currently
No, P1.
they're under P1.
If they were demolishing now,
they fall under P1 at the moment, because that allows for as at the date that the rules became operative, which was November 2016. So yes.
So that's fine.
So that they wouldn't have a change from the current situation.
That's really good. And the other one is there anything in this proposal that would stop us or make it more difficult to have additional, more restrictive rules in the coastal hazards chapter of the district plan, should that be assessed as being desirable through the upcoming district plan work?
No.
So it might be that in 2 or 3 years' time, when we've kind of finalised that work, that we actually put more restrictive rules back in place here, and we could absolutely do that.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Phil?
Thank you very much for your further report and all this work. I just want to clarify, the houses which have got, like, empty sections where the house has been demolished, does that include places that were demolished before the earthquake, or does it mean after the earthquake?
Only
After September 2010.
Okay, thank you. And my other question really is in relation to the point 620 is around risk being mitigated by three areas, and this is because the P2 is more enabling. One being that there's a limited number, just the 32 properties. The last one being that there's a strategic approach to the risk being developed in relation to sea level rise. But my question is, like, how would that risk actually be mitigated, or future risk, if the design's already been approved and the house is built? How can the risk be mitigated?
So it's essentially what these provisions are doing is putting these people in the same situation that everyone else in that suburb is in, and it's about saying that the council needs to have a strategic approach to existing development in an area at risk from sea level rise and coastal hazards in the future across the board, rather than targeted at a few individual property owners at this stage. And when that strategic approach is developed, that will be able to address all of those owners.
So they would still need to build to known current risks in mitigation, such as the higher floor levels and things like that. So it's not what they had, it's what the rules are that they would be required to rebuild to, and whether they're the current rules, or whether they're, as the RDA does require, take into account future hazards as well.
So with those 32 properties, are they now at no greater risk than the other properties?
Are the 32 properties now at no greater risk today or in the future?
Well, both actually, today and the future.
Today, no. In the future, they're no different in terms of their risk exposure to other properties in the residential unit overlay.
In the future?
Yeah. Okay. But whether or not you can mitigate that risk in terms of the impact on people, property and land is at the crux of the challenge that everyone will face. So the mitigation from the future hazard needs to be for people, property and land. So and there's various ways to mitigate that.
Okay.
But you'll still, well, staff will still provide people with advice and support,
Absolutely.
even though they're not going through a resource consent process. So what we've done is to reduce or minimise the resource consent obligations, well, to remove the resource consent obligations, but they'll still have access to advice.
Absolutely, and we'd actually like to improve on that advice that's available at the moment as well, in terms of updating the LIM notations and the comms that we have on the website as well for the residential unit overlay and high flood hazard management area.
Yeah, and I'd be very keen to, I mean, I was very pleased to hear you talk about a practice note for consent staff and a quality assurance process for advice provided, because I think that will also give people some reassurance. They'll be able to read stuff before they go down to the office and have a chat to someone.
And I see Nathan is looking at the back of the room as well, and he knows these 32 properties well, and the property owners know Nathan well, and he is well regarded in terms of the pragmatic and helpful advice that he can and does provide on most of these matters. So
It would be nice if we're allowed to have a nod from Nathan that this will make life easier for the work that he's doing. Thank you. No, that's brilliant. Are there any other questions? David, would you like to move? Seconded by Dion. I'll open it up for discussion. David? Oh, yeah, okay, right. You can wrap up the debate. Sarah?
Thank you. I'd just like to start by saying I share the concerns of both Ngāi Tahu and ECAN around the impacts of climate disruption and sea level rise in this area. But however, as I see it, and as is really, really clear, this proposal, while we're putting a lot of time and effort in, it's only a temporary measure. The report's clear, and so have our staff, being that the coastal hazards work will cover the same area, and that the new chapter in the district plan may very well put new rules in place, more restrictive rules in place for building here over time. And so let us enable those few who have struggled to rebuild their homes and their lives following the earthquakes to do so. And let's get on with the incredibly important work of engaging with our communities on how we adapt to our changing environment.
Thank you. Yanni?
Yeah, thank you. As someone who brought the notice of motion to council, I just want to commend staff for the urgency with which they've addressed this issue, and acknowledge that it has been very stressful for people in these local communities that are affected. But I do want to just place on record my acknowledgement of the incredible work that you've done in a very short space of time to find a solution to what was clearly an issue. So thank you very much. I think the other key thing going forward from this is obviously we'll submit this to the Minister, and then it's essentially out of our hands. But actually, in terms of lessons learnt, post-earthquake, the whole idea of having a central bureaucracy that imposes unique things on a city has meant that it's incredibly frustrating to find solutions when things haven't turned out as expected. And when you're in a dynamic environment, the ability to make changes with flexibility is absolutely crucial, because you won't get everything right straight after a major event like an earthquake that we've had. So hopefully the lessons learnt can be incorporated, but actually more importantly going forward is the collaboration which we've shown in the last few months with our community around coming up with this proposed change, hopefully is a model for how we engage going forward on coastal hazards and actually other district planning matters. There are a whole bunch of district planning issues that we're confronted with as a city, and we need to make sure we have a very collaborative and engaged community to get the best results going forward. So I welcome the longer term engagement around coastal hazards and around the future of our district plan, but today is really about the action that we set in train a few weeks ago, progressing to the final stage, which is to submit it to the Minister, and I'm very supportive of getting this in front of her as soon as possible, so I'm really happy to support this today.
Good. Anyone else? I want to say a couple of words then before I hand over to you, David. Look, and it's to repeat what I said before, which is to thank staff for the incredible effort that they've put in a very short space of time. And I think that we've achieved something that at the beginning of this process I didn't think would be possible in terms of the time frames. I remember standing up at a meeting in New Brighton and saying, you know, we've heard from the community loud and clear, fix it first, and then have a review of what happened in terms of how we got to this position in the first place. The fix it first, I said be careful what you wish for, because the community was saying Section 71 was the answer. I explained that it was a very in-depth process, that it would require sign-off of all the strategic partners, and that once it got in front of the Minister, it had to be, it would be a question of yes or no. So there was no opportunity for mistakes along the way, which is why I've asked my questions today. We have to be crystal clear about what we're trying to achieve. I think what was useful about the process was the fact of being able to go back to two of the people that sat on the independent hearings panel that actually heard this particular part of this chapter, and to have advice from Sarah Dawson, the planner who sat on this particular chapter, to assist us with some changes to the wording that had been proposed by a staff, not by a staff member, but by an expert appearing for the council during the independent hearings panel process. So I actually think that we've ended up with a better policy statement of what was trying to be achieved to support the residential unit overlay in the district plan as a result of the process that we've gone through, because I think the wording that was proposed by the council by way of a drafting exercise for the independent hearings panel wasn't actually quite adequate for its purpose. We've now ended up with a clause that we can justify to the Minister, and we've also managed to address what is another discrepancy really in the plan, which is the lack of clarity around the housing, or the timing of a house's demolition. So it seems ridiculous to have one set of rules, permitted activity, for a house that was demolished yesterday, but one that was demolished the day before, the one that's been demolished before the rule came in. So 12 months before the rule came in, the day the rule comes in, no longer are they covered by it. So they were absolutely dependent on the residential unit overlay. So I think we've ended up with an excellent position, and again, just thank you so much for doing that. And again, just a shout out to the community as well. I know that this has been stressful, but all of the community, from the community board all the way through to the community organisations, they have really gone out of their way to distribute information and to help improve awareness once we've got to the fix-it stage. So I'm hoping that the next stage, which is the kind of the review, the reflecting back on what's happened, I hope that that also gets the same level of buy-in. So thank you very much on behalf of the council, and I'll hand it over to you, David, to wind up the debate.
Thank you. Look, as you're aware, on the 3rd of September I launched a campaign with the support of others on behalf of the people of South New Brighton, South Shore and Redcliffe. These communities represented some 1,500 property owners, some of which have faced huge uncertainty when it came to selling, altering or rebuilding on land within the residential unit overlay. Today, some 2 months on, I wish to acknowledge and thank the Christchurch City Council for listening to their concerns and working under urgency to draft this proposed amendment to the district plan in relation to the residential unit overlay using Section 71 of the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Act 2016. I wish to also acknowledge the strategic partners for their prompt and favourable consideration of the Section 71 process. The last 2 months have been by no means easy. I knew that prior to embarking on this campaign that I would be criticised for my actions. However, first and foremost, as with every elected member of this council, I am accountable to the public for my actions and the manner in which I carry out my responsibilities in representing them. Since the 3rd of November, I have been mindful of my obligations to uphold the law, act in accordance with the highest degree of integrity, respect and trust which the public expects of all elected members of this council. I am, however, sorry for any statements I made during my media conference on the 3rd of September might have been perceived by some as an unjustified criticism that reflected negatively on the competency and integrity of any staff or the organisation as a whole. This was certainly not my intention, and I wish to apologise to anyone that thought that this was the case. I would like to offer a personal thanks to Kim Money and Tim Sinters from the Coastal Burwood Community Board and Daryl Latham from the Linwood Central Community Board, Linwood Central Heathcote, sorry, Community Board. They didn't hesitate in joining me on the 3rd of September, and I am immensely grateful for their collective support, guidance, encouragement and strength. I wish to also extend similar thanks to the Christchurch Coastal Residents United for the significant amount of work that they have done in helping us arrive at this momentous decision today. When we embarked on this campaign, we were all determined to provide strong advocacy on behalf of the people of South New Brighton, South Shore and Redcliffe that sought our help to pursue accountability and justice to right what they considered was a serious wrongdoing. In closing, as the elected councillor representing the Coastal Ward, I would like to offer my personal apology to all of those property owners that have suffered undue and unnecessary financial stress, or their health has seriously been impacted by the consequences of the omission of the policy. I think it's a great step forward, and I really do just want to reiterate my thanks to the staff and council for the swiftness of action that has occurred to bring this proposal forward in council and now send it on to the Minister for final consideration. Thank you.
So just before I put the motion, I'm going to breach standing orders and just remind the councillors that Yanni Johansson was the one that brought the notice of motion to the meeting, and I should have let him move this motion, so I apologise to Yanni for that. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried.